We'll get it right eventually. All right, well, good morning, everyone. You are the hardcore. Aren't you proud? And you could be in church today. Instead, I'm going to be up here delivering a sermon, so, oh well. Anyway, so here's what I want to talk about. I'm going to be talking a little bit about philosophy of science. I hope that doesn't scare anyone. What I want to talk about is something about the history of evolutionary biology, because I think it's very illuminating. It tells us something about how we think about things. So for instance, everyone is comfortable with the idea that there are facts about the universe that are true, right? The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Boom, we're done. Well, yeah, there's wobble in there, but it's around 4.5 billion years old. That's a fact. Can't argue with that. There are also these things called theories. We use theories to explain the facts. So for instance, we can say that the Earth condensed from the solar nebula many billions of years ago. There was physical properties of matter that brought it all together and formed it. That's a pretty good theory too. You could argue a little bit more with that. In particular, you could argue with my rather superficial explanation of it. But it's still a valid explanation for how the Earth came to be. But there's another level beyond that, and all too often we ignore it. And that level is meaning. What the heck does it mean to human beings, to our culture, that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old? And we all agree, I think, that what it provides is perspective on ourselves. And what it says is, yeah, human beings are this short-lived species that emerged just recently. You know, we're only like 100 to 200,000 years old. And it puts in perspective that the Earth is probably not intended just for us. It's not, there's not a purpose to existence on Earth that is aimed directly at us. So that's an idea of meaning. One thing I want to get across to everybody is creationists, for instance, know this. Creationists are perfectly aware of the facts. They know that science says the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. They know that science has a material explanation for the origin of the Earth. And they know that if they accept those facts, that means that, oh, the human race is kind of an insignificant part of the cosmos. And I will tell you something that may horrify you. Creationists actually make a rational decision to reject the facts. If the meaning is important to you, then when you come up with facts that negate your meaning, your personal meaning for the way the world is, that's a rational decision to say, I'm going to ignore those facts. Now, you're all thinking, okay, well that's creationists. Creationists, they're stupid, right? No, they don't know. No. They're not that stupid, because the thing is, we all do this. Every single one of us is sitting here with a body of ideas in our head, and we select what evidence we're going to accept. And we shape our theories on the basis of what's going on up here in our heads, what's going on in our culture around us. So that's one of the points I want to make here, is that when you look at the history of evolutionary biology, we see that going along all the time, that there are modifications to the theory based not on the facts, but on the meaning to the people that are arguing them. Now, doesn't that sound like a delightful way to wake up on a Sunday morning? Yes, let's ponder the meaning of science. Okay, but let me make it concrete. Well, I'm going to talk about the history of evolutionary theory. So we're going to talk about what people were thinking way back in the 19th century and where they came up with this idea of evolution. So first thing, let me explain something. Okay, so here's a map of the British Isles, and we're going to say this is roughly during the Regency period. So if you read those Regency romances, you know all about this, right? Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth Bennet, all that kind of, yeah, this is. What were they thinking then? Well, they had a number of questions about the world. They noticed something that was kind of taken for granted. That is, if you look around England, what you find is that there are certain animals there, right? you find rabbits, you find robin redbreast, you find sheep, you find more sheep, lots of sheep everywhere. So one question in everybody's mind, well, let's put it this way. When they thought about it, this was in their mind, but often they just simply took it for granted, is how come sheep are doing so well? What explains the existence of sheep in the British Isles? Is it because something created this land specifically for the sheep? Or is it because sheep were shaped somehow to thrive in this particular region, in this particular climate, with this kind of particular foodstuff? So they wondered about this. And that was one question in their head. Now obviously they had an answer, right? God made it that way. That's kind of a cheat of an answer. It's kind of saying, okay, well God just did this. But I'll mention in a moment there were some other explanations floating around. Now during this same period of like 1820 or thereabouts, something else was happening, and that is that the British people were sending out ships to explore the world. And they were doing things like colonialism and imperialism along the way, but also there was a lot of just voyages of discovery. Let's go collect things. Let's go find out what's living in New Guinea, what's living in South America. Let's do collections and send them back. People actually made quite a bit of money doing this. Alfred Russel Wallace, who you may have heard of, for instance, he consciously chose a career to make a decision exploring the jungles of Southeast Asia and mailing butterflies back to collectors. He actually made a living at this. So this is a big deal. But then it raised a new problem. Okay, here's another set of islands. This is not to scale. They are much smaller than the British Isles, but you get the idea. This is the Galapagos Islands. And when you go to the Galapagos Islands, what you find is a characteristic fauna there, too. You find tortoises, you find finches, you find iguanas, you find lots and lots of iguanas, all right? If any of you have been to the Galapagos, that's the first thing you see is swarms of these big lizards all over the shore. And this raised a problem for people in this period. Aren't good old English sheep good enough for the Galapagos? Why aren't there sheep on the Galapagos? And if they're open-minded enough, they wonder, where are all of the British iguanas? We are lacking this particular organism. Why is that? Now this is a much more serious problem to them. You know, like I said, when you're talking about why are there sheep in England, you can just say, well, God put them there and God made England the perfect place for sheep. But now you discover that there are these places where there are different animals. And you can't simply say, well, it's because sheep wouldn't thrive on those islands. Because I'll tell you right now that way back around this time, people were importing sheep and in particular goats to the Galapagos Islands, and they were taken off like gangbusters and thriving just fine in this climate. So the Galapagos are made for goats as well. And again, if you've been to the Galapagos, you wander around the islands, you discover goat skeletons everywhere because they've been slaughtering the goats to get rid of this invasive species. So anyway, we know that this is not the case. It was not that it's inhospitable to sheep or goats. We can also see that in Australia, for instance. Australia, you got wallabies all over the place. And what have you got now? You got sheep. Sheep are doing great in Australia. Also rabbits, all these imported English animals are just doing a wonderful job thriving and exterminating everything else on the continent. So you can't make that kind of adaptive excuse and say, well, it's because this was a perfect place for them. So what it really means is that at this time, before Charles Darwin, there were two big questions. Then the two big questions were the question of adaptation. How do things become well suited to their environment? And the other is diversity. Why are there so many different things? You know, we could imagine a world that was populated just by people and sheep and cows and pigs, right? That's within the bounds of our imagination. Why didn't God make the world like that, was the big question. Why did he make those hideous iguanas? Okay, well, the first question, as I said, they've got some explanations for this. And as I said, one explanation is simply creation. So this is what they're arguing here. So on the left, what you see is an old diagram where there's a ladder of creation. So, you could ask also, why are there all these inferior animals around that don't taste good? And they're, why do we have earthworms? You can't eat earthworms. They're horrible. And the answer was, again, a religious one, that God created this ladder of creation where all the rungs are populated with different species. And this leads to a hypothesis that maybe that's why there are all these different forms, is because they all have their place in the mind of God. Okay, again, if you're thinking theologically, there's no problem with this. If you're thinking materially, thinking about natural causes, this is a little problematic. You want a natural explanation for this. And over there on the right is a snapshot of an early model for all of this. I'm going to be calling this the developmental model, but there were a lot of different people that came up with similar ideas. Lots of different names for this, but we'll just call it the developmental model for now. And what this developmental model said is that how human beings start off as one cell, and then they go through a series of changes through development, emerge as a baby, and then grow up to a child, and grow up to an adolescent, and then grow up to an adult. What they argued is that species have a similar property, that species have an inbuilt pattern of progressive change over millennia. And so what we're seeing when we look at the world around us is variation because of this pattern of development. It's like right now in human society, you can look around, maybe not in this room, but you go out in the wide world, and what you find is you find young people, and you find pregnant women, and you find old people, and you find all these different stages of development. And they're saying that maybe this is the explanation. It also fit with an old-fashioned mindset that there's a hierarchy. You notice in the diagram on the right that there is this nice hierarchy where God is at the top still, and minerals are at the bottom, and then plants, and then animals. Notice that women are a lesser stage than men. Don't worry, ladies, if you just hang around a few thousand years longer, maybe you'll grow up to be a real man. Anyway, so there's this progressive model for everything. Now, that's the theory at this time. So if you walked around in Europe in 1820 or thereabouts, and you talk to scientists and natural historians and philosophers, they give you some story like this to explain adaptation and diversity. Then this guy comes along. Charles Darwin. You've all heard of him, right? Oh, man, that was a lot of emphasis on... Okay. So there's Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, he's open to these ideas as well. In fact, he read a number of books like Paley's Natural Theology. He thought it was great. Paley's Natural Theology was full of that kind of developmental model story. And so he's thinking, this is just fine. And he goes off to the Galapagos, and he runs into this same issue that, wow, the Galapagos Islands are really different than the British Islands. How could this be? What's the explanation for this? And he came up with one, which I don't have to rehash, because this is a room full of secular people. We're all familiar with Darwin. So I'll say a little bit about it anyway. And he comes back, and he doesn't really do anything publicly about his idea for 30 years. So you all knew this too, right? He goes to the Galapagos in the 1820s. He comes back with his head full of great ideas and all kinds of empirical evidence, and then he sits on it for 30 years until 1859 when he publishes it. One of the things he was doing during this period is he was doing more experiments. He was doing all kinds of experiments to test his hypothesis. What I'm going to say to surprise you just a little bit is you may be thinking, when you think of Charles Darwin, you think of, oh, natural selection, right? He's doing experiments on natural selection. No, he wasn't, because he was much more interested in the second question. He wasn't as interested in adaptedness, to everyone's surprise, I'm sure, as he was in diversity. And so while he was home in England, he was doing all these experiments to explain how these things came to be. Why is there such a diversity? It's why he called his book On the Origin of Species. Is because that's what interested him. Why do we get all these different species all over the places? And as you know, he closed that book with this statement, this one that gets quoted all over the place. There's grandeur in this view of life with several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, the most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. That's a statement about diversity, not the adaptiveness question. This is what he's summarizing his book by saying, is I've just explained to you why things are so different everywhere. And that was the nature of the experiments he was doing. So for instance, his hypothesis was this, that when he went off on the voyage of the Beagle, he spent 2 weeks in the Galapagos Islands. Just 2 weeks, that's all. And those 2 weeks were spent after spending 2 years in South America. So this is just a little map with little dotted lines all over the place. He got seasick a lot, so when they got to the shores of South America, the first thing he did was get the hell off the boat, go rent a horse, and go galloping off into the hinterland and explore South America. He became the world's foremost authority on the flora and fauna of South America, also on the geology of South America. So this is where he's at. He's out there sampling diversity. He's doing collections. He's doing taxonomy. He's looking at what's growing here, what's growing there, what are all these different forms that we find in South America that are so different than what we see in England. And he becomes an authority on that. And then he goes off to the Galapagos after spending 2 years mastering South America, understanding what lives there. He gets to the Galapagos, and the first thing he notices is that the species that live there are awfully similar to the ones on the South American mainland. He was familiar with iguanas. He knew what iguanas looked like. He gets to the Galapagos, there are iguanas. So what's the explanation for why there are iguanas in the Galapagos and not in England? It's because the Galapagos is close enough to South America that you can imagine in a storm something, iguanas getting trapped on branches and drifting off to this other island and colonizing it. So that's what he's interested in. He wants to know, how do things get there? And so when he gets back to England, a lot of his experiments are things like, oh, let's see how long plant seeds can survive drifting in salt water. Let me write to his correspondents around the world and ask, how long does it take for something to drift from island X to island Y? He's getting all this information about diversity. Of course, then he also notices, of course, it was really obvious, in the South American mainland, iguanas climb in trees and eat leaves, okay? On the Galapagos, they live near the shore, they swim, and they eat seaweed and algae. He's got to explain that too. And that's where it all begins to come together. That's where he comes up with his explanation of natural selection. He imagines, let's imagine a bunch of iguanas from South America getting blown across the ocean, landing in this barren, horrible, awful, hot place called the Galapagos Islands. And what those iguanas then have to do is find something to eat. And it's an arid shore. There's none of the plant material they're used to eating. So what they'll do is they'll go looking for anything. Oh yeah, there's the seaweed. Let's go eat that. The ones that couldn't eat that died. The ones that could eat it survived. There's his natural selection story. So he's explained both diversity and adaptation with this one great idea. Okay, so I think you understand what I'm talking about. It's two ideas, right? He's giving answers to both of them. And Darwin's personal interest is specifically in diversity. Adaptation is just a side effect that leads to even more diversity. Okay, now this is what he writes up in The Origin of Species. This is what spreads all around the world, this great idea. Takes off like a storm. It's a very popular book. Now what I want to talk about, though, is what happened to his theory after it got out into the world. It doesn't stay static. How many of you here have read On the Origin of Species? A few of you, yeah. Most of us have read secondary sources. We've read descriptions of this. We've read descriptions of new evidence, things like this. But we've kind of left that behind. And that's normal for science. That what you'll do is you'll provide an explanation, and then people will expand on it and build on it. So most of us aren't really familiar with what's in the origin. And it's also true that even Darwin himself changed his ideas over time. There have been many editions of the origin published during his lifetime, and they all changed in interesting ways. It's actually kind of fun to go through and see what he added. So for instance, there were questions about inheritance. How do things get inherited? He comes up with a theory of inheritance. It's all wrong, and it's there in the later editions. So there's things like that. But also, we begin to see signs of where human bias can affect a theory. And I'll give you one example of this from Darwin himself. So Darwin famously made this comment in his notes. He said it's absurd to talk of one animal being higher than another. And this is something modern biologists take to heart. That what Darwin is basically saying is if you hold the skull of a human being here and you hold the shell of a clam over here, you can't say that one is more advanced, more evolved, superior, better than the other. You all get that, right? They've all evolved for equal amounts of time. They've all become adapted to a particular niche in the environment. So he's saying specifically, you can't do that. You can't say that the one is better than the other. And that's a really good sentiment to hold in your head. Keep that in mind when you're trying to judge other people or other animals and say which one's better than the other, which one you like better. But at the same time, Darwin also said this. And a lot of creationists like to quote mine this one. And he said, at some future period, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. Yes, Darwin was a racist. He was a liberal racist. At least he was trying to work in the right way. But you gotta face the fact that no, he was, like all of us have these kinds of attitudes in our heads, and it was kind of affecting his judgment in this case. Because what he's basically saying here is that he can hold the skull of a European in this hand and the skull of an African in this hand, and he can say, oh yeah, this one's better. And that's not true. So there's always these internal biases that are shaping our interpretation, our meaning of a theory. Darwin has this marvelous theory that he's going to be famous for forever, and yet at the same time he's uncomfortable. He's made really uncomfortable by the idea that his superior British race wasn't necessarily better than a bunch of Africans. There's several other incidents in the literature we could talk about where Darwin exhibits this kind of mental blindness. Okay, now other people are going to take up this banner of evolutionary theory. And one I'm sure you've heard of. You've all heard of Thomas Henry Huxley, right? Yeah. Darwin's bulldog, a really famous guy. I might surprise many of you with this. Did you know that Thomas Henry Huxley did not accept natural selection? Oh, yeah. It's really weird when you read this stuff. You read Thomas Henry Huxley, he fully accepts the idea of evolution. He thinks it's great. He believes in common descent. He thinks that everything's related to everything else. He's a comparative anatomist and physiologist, and that's what he does for entertainment. He actually gives shows where he dissects animals in front of the audience. Wouldn't that be fun to do sometime? Anyway, he does these dissections, and he compares these. And he says, look, here's a chimpanzee, here's a dead guy. We'll take them apart and I'll show you they're pretty much the same internally. So he's fully accepting that part of it, but he questions natural selection. He actually annoyed Charles Darwin so much Darwin appreciated the fact that Huxley was going out there fighting for him, but at the same time, he keeps chafing because he keeps raising these objections. So here's an example. This is from Thomas Huxley's review of The Origin that was published in, I think it was 1860, and he's asking this question: is it satisfactorily proved that species may be originated by selection? That there is such a thing as natural selection? He's questioning natural selection. I have some trepidation about telling you this, because if there's a creationist in the audience, you've just found a new source for quote mining. Go read Thomas Huxley's papers, and you will discover that he's raising all these principled objections. So what he's saying here is that we can't really answer these questions yet because Charles Darwin's book did not do the experiments to test selection. It didn't. I just told you. He proposed selection as a model, but his main interest was diversity. How do we get all these different forms? And that's what engaged Charles Darwin. And he didn't really test natural selection. In case you're having doubts that maybe it's not true, I'll just tell you that many people have tested natural selection since. There have been experiments that demonstrate it, and so it's not in question anymore. But in Darwin's day, it was a good, legitimate question. And I have to hand it to T.H. Huxley for actually being brave enough to go up against the most famous scientist in the land and say, well, it's pretty good, but there's some gaps in your theory. You need to do more work. Okay, so that's one approach you can do. I think this is a very principled approach. This is a good thing for a scientist to do, is question the theory and ask, can you demonstrate this a little bit more positively? There's somebody else who comes along at the same time who's also an advocate of Charles Darwin. This guy is entirely on Charles Darwin's side. He accepts it all completely. And it's this guy, Herbert Spencer. Who has heard of Herbert Spencer? A few of you. Okay. Herbert Spencer was the most famous English-speaking philosopher of the 19th century. And you never hear of him. Almost no classes anywhere teach Herbert Spencer's philosophy anymore. It's kind of strange. It's like he sold his soul to the devil for worldly fame during his lifetime. Then after he died, everyone just dropped him and said, no, we're done with this guy. Herbert Spencer was a very interesting fellow. He was a smart guy. And he had his own ideas. For instance, he came up with the theory of evolution before Charles Darwin. He published it in 1851. Unfortunately, his theory of evolution was that developmental model that I described earlier, where he's got this kind of semi-mystical idea that species undergo progressive change. He also believed in a kind of Lamarckism. It was not a satisfactory explanation. It also wasn't based on empirical evidence like Darwin, so it wasn't that impressive. But he did come up with a theory of evolution. The wrong theory. Still, everyone was really, in the 19th century, mid-19th century, everybody was coming up with evolutionary theories. Charles Darwin's main strength was he came up with the right one, okay? What's also interesting about Herbert Spencer, though, is that once Darwin did publish his theory, he embraced it wholeheartedly and made it his own and loved it and wrote his own long essays on Darwin's theory of evolution, explained it, and he came up with his own explanations. For instance, Spencer is the guy who came up with a phrase you've almost certainly heard of, survival of the fittest. This was the main message to Herbert Spencer, is not the diversity side of the story, but the adapted side of the story. And what he argued is that all species were selected to be superior, and that superior individuals rose to the top and had the most success reproducing and didn't die and all that kind of stuff. And that was the important message of evolutionary theory to Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer also was kind of a proto-libertarian. Some of you who read my blog know my opinion of libertarians. It's not good. Don't take it personally, but I'm not a fan of libertarian thought at all. And he had a lot of interesting ideas along those lines too. He thought that if you just let people go, if you got rid of the state altogether, and you just had this kind of laissez-faire capitalism running loose on everything, then the best would naturally rise to succeed and the lowest would disappear, and gradually the state would become unnecessary because it would be ruled by a capitalist elite. It's a really weird book. If you run into a social statistics text, it's an interesting book to read. And this led to a lot of interesting conclusions from Herbert Spencer. So, for instance, he makes this statement. We have unmistakable proof that throughout all past time there has been a ceaseless devouring of the weak by the strong. This is the message of evolution. You're all going to die. If you're weak, I'm having you for lunch. That's the story. And it just got more and more extreme as he got older. You know, he started out, he was fairly liberal. As he got older, he got crankier and more conservative and weirder. You know, he started off saying all men and women are equal when he was young, and in his old age, he fought ferociously against women's suffrage. That women, they just cannot handle the vote, was his argument. But also, he was not happy with the poor. So here's another statement from him. The poverty of the incapable, the distresses that come upon the imprudent, the starvation of the idle, and all those shoulderings aside of the weak by the strong, which leave so many in shallows and in miseries, are the decrees of a large, far-seeing benevolence. Yeah. Spencer wasn't exactly an atheist. He did not accept Christian dogma. He called himself an agnostic. He was more of a deist, but he did think that there was some kind of mystical force pervading the universe that would provide a direction. And one of those directions is, let's get rid of those crappy poor people. And he also made this statement: with a higher moral nature will come a restriction on the multiplication of the inferior. So the better we get, the better society will be at suppressing the poor. This is kind of his message. And you can sort of see where this is going. This is leading up to eugenics. And Spencer is going to be a champion also of the whole principle of eugenics. Now you can see what's happening to Darwin's theory already. This is contemporary with Darwin's life. That they're ignoring the message of diversity, focusing on the message of adaptedness, and saying, okay, well that means that those of us who are well off deserve to be there because we're obviously superior beings. So this is going to lead to this guy, Francis Galton. Now you've heard of Francis Galton, right? Okay, I heard a laugh. What? Yeah, Francis Galton was a weird dude. He was Charles Darwin's cousin. He was well connected. He was also pretty smart. He came up with a lot of statistics, lots of concepts and statistics that we still use. He came up with the idea of a correlation, for instance. So he's a serious mathematician. He's got some good ideas. But he was also a hardcore advocate of eugenics, where eugenics, as you may have heard of, is the idea that you should take the unfit in the population and not allow them to breed by sterilization or death, if you're a Nazi. And you should give special advantages to the ones that already have advantages, because obviously they've earned them. So he was a big pioneer of the whole idea of eugenics. Now, you read this statement, and it's kind of persuasive, right? Yeah, there are differences in people, there's variations in people. Some are clearly not suited to living in our society. So why not shove them off to the edge? I know, that still sounds so callous. No matter how hard you try, you can't make eugenics sound nice. Anyway, so there was this idea. But then at the same time, Galton had some really crazy ideas, and he spewed them all over the place. If you really want something entertaining to do for an afternoon, go dig up the archives on Francis Galton and read some of his letters to the editor of various newspapers. He is full of ideas, and he's sharing them with the world. For example, this one, he said, obviously, Africans, inferior. terrible people, lazy, and all this kind of stuff. And his great idea was that the British government ought to grab a bunch of Chinese people and settle them in Africa, and because they're superior to the blacks, they would expand and fill the continent with industry and wealth. Yeah, let's not think about methods, and let's not think about assumptions here. There's a lot of assumptions there. Another thing he did that just tells you a little bit about his personality is this. This is a pedigree that Galton put together. Notice that notice that one of the categories is brilliant, and he's trying to determine the heritability of brilliance. And so he identified brilliant people in his own family tree, which prominently includes himself, of course, and Charles Darwin, and their grandfathers. You know, so there's this kind of self-serving aspect to it. Notice also, if you know how to read pedigrees, you know the squares are all men and the circles are all women. Isn't it strange how no women ever inherit scientific ability? He never thought about, obviously it must be because of something intrinsic to their brains. I got to tell you another story about Francis Galton. My favorite story of Francis Galton is he invented the pricker. What the pricker was he took a thimble and he put a little pin on the end of it, and when he was out walking, what he would do is he would put a piece of paper in his pocket, and he could reach down with his pricker and he could punch holes in it to mark a scale. And what he was doing is judging women. So he'd walk around and he'd put a piece of paper in his pocket in the morning, and he'd walk out into the neighborhood and he'd look at people and he'd just sort of reach down here. Oh, let's see, what is she? And what is she? And he'd make all these scores, and then he published it. Isn't that just the creepiest thing ever? And he came to the conclusion, obviously the scientific, empirical conclusion, that women of London were much prettier than those Scottish hags. He actually has a gradient of ugliness across the British Isles, from beautiful in London to ugly up at the top. So there's all this going on. So it's surprising that Galton, his reputation has actually survived, because when you read his stuff, it's the most appalling and invented excuses for all kinds of eugenics. Now the point of this, though, is that how theories change, that this has modified our understanding of evolution, because what it's done is it's made this adaptedness the height and the most important thing in the story. And when you look at what Spencer wrote, for instance, Survival of the Fittest, what it implies is that evolution is a succession of battles for the victor to then capture all the women and breed. And the thing is, that's gotten into the public. That's the public perception of evolution. This is from Answers in Genesis, a credible source. This is their model of evolution that they show to kids to explain how evolution works. And it's just a chain of things beating each other up and killing each other, and the winner emerges at the top. It's terrible. This is not how evolution works. Now, lest you think that it's just the creationists that are this wacky. It's just those stupid creationists screwing things up. Who's ever paid attention to the Darwin Awards? Yeah. I hate the Darwin Awards. All the hands suddenly went down. Anyway, no. The Darwin Awards have as their assumption that what will happen is, that what's happening is this great culling of the population. It's stupid people killing each other off, and we should reward that as the outcome, the proper outcome of Darwinian selection. And that's not the case at all. Darwin would be horrified if he were alive today to see his name used in the Darwin Awards, because it is not at all reflective of his sentiments about how evolution proceeds at all. So let me just mention, then one more guy here. This is kind of the anti-Spencer. This is Prince Pyotr Alexeyevitch Kropotkin. And I got to ask you now, who's heard of Kropotkin before? Oh, so few hands. This is tragic. Kropotkin was really an amazing guy. Look at that beard, okay? Just the beard, you know. What a magnificent specimen of humanity. I should work on that. Anyway, as you can also guess from his title, he was a member of the Russian nobility. And he is a hero of communists all around the world because he renounced his titles, he gave it all up, and he wrote a whole bunch of really interesting books promoting the idea of anarchism. How's that for a thrilling read? Yeah. I mean, this is America. I'm sure you're all thrilled with the idea of anarchy. Anyway, this was a principled anarchy. In some ways, he was very much like Herbert Spencer. He thought that if we got rid of government altogether, we would evolve to a higher state where we didn't need government, not because of a capitalist oligarchy arising, but because people are intrinsically good and would help each other. And that we'd build communities built on equality and self-respect. He's a dreamer, okay. I like the dream. I don't believe it would happen, but it's a nice dream. So, you know, but the other thing is, he was a biologist. He did a lot of field work in a place a lot of people didn't want to go. He did field work in the Siberian Arctic, looking at organisms there, doing natural history and taxonomy, just as Darwin had been doing in South America. And he also really liked Charles Darwin's work. He's another promoter of Darwinian evolution in Russia. And so, for instance, here's what he says about in The Descent of Man. He pointed out how in numberless animal societies, the struggle between separate individuals for the means of existence disappears, how struggle is replaced by cooperation, and how that substitution results in the development of intellectual and moral faculties which secure to the species the best conditions for survival. In his book, Mutual Aid, Kropotkin makes a long case, a very convincing case, that an important aspect of evolutionary progress, if we want to call it progress, is cooperation. It's animals working together and in animal societies that leads to real success and survival. Not fighting and killing each other. That successful societies all develop mechanisms to suppress that kind of violence. Okay. And he makes this case, you know, that when you, so again, this is a long quote, but he's saying, when he looks at the observation of the animal kingdom, what he sees is this, that it's best described by the word solidarity. And that solidarity has played an infinitely larger part in the development of the animal kingdom than all the adaptations that have resulted from a struggle between individuals to acquire personal advantages. Like I said, it's a convincing book because, like Darwin's book, he backs it up with evidence. That, for instance, one of the big stories in his book is, you know, Siberian Arctic, he looked at musk oxen. You all know what musk oxen do when they're threatened, right? They form a circle with all the big older bulls facing outward, the vulnerable females and the young in the center, and nothing can get through. You do not want to tangle with musk ox, okay? They're pretty mean animals when it gets down to that. And they're really good at defending each other. That's a cooperative behavior. And what he's arguing is that what species are doing is they're not just fighting against each other, they're fighting against a larger environment, and often fighting isn't the right word, it's just trying to survive, and that cooperation is an important part of that. Now maybe you haven't seen muskox, but you all watched the March of the Penguins, right? No, some people are shaking their heads, you should go see it, it's fun, it's a really interesting movie. Anyway, these emperor penguins, what do? Every year, the males go strolling out onto the ice, and they go deep into the interior, and they carry their eggs with them, and then they huddle together through the winter like this. They just form these huge masses of birds that are all just lined up there in freezing Antarctic weather, winds blowing, snow coming down, and what they'll do is they'll shuffle around. So every penguin will spend a little bit of time on the outside where it's coldest, like these poor guys here, facing the cold Antarctic winds, and then every once in a while they'll work their way into the center and somebody else will take their place. So there's this constant milling mob of penguins keeping warm in the middle, protecting the group on the outside. That's cooperative behavior. All penguins would be extinct if they were capitalists. If they all said, I'm staying in the middle, and then there was a big fight between the penguins trying to stay in the middle and taking the poor losers, and they all have to stay out there and freeze to death on the outside. Penguins would be extinct today. They would not survive except for cooperation. Now you're saying, okay, Kropotkin, he's in the Arctic, and here we're talking about the Antarctic. Those are weird places. That can't be this true anywhere. But look at chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are highly cooperative animals. They live in little societies. They have little tribes where they're actually cooperating with one another. A solo chimpanzee is a dead chimpanzee. The same could be said of human beings. Solitary human beings are dead, okay? We are here depending on the products of an elaborate technology produced by a large culture in order to keep warm, or in this case, to keep cooler than the outside. Another example, again, this is a beautiful example of human cooperation for a not so pleasant purpose. This is the Seleucid Phalanx. So, about 400 BC, 300 BC, there was this empire, and they conquered much of the world. This is the descendants of Alexander the Great, and they built these elaborate phalanxes. This is all about cooperation. You got the front rank with shields and long spears hanging out there. You got second rank all poised. This is a deadly looking phenomenon, doesn't it? Scary stuff. This is what conquered much of the Middle East. And it's all a product of cooperation. Similarly, I think if anybody here is a veteran or is a military person, you know that what the military teaches is not, here is a set of heroics you have to do. It's band of brothers stuff. It's leave no man behind. It's work as a unit, cooperate. So all that stuff is an important aspect of human behavior as well, is that we cooperate. Even in our violent impulses, it's all a matter of cooperation. Okay, so the point I've been making is theories change. The meaning of theories is imposed in all kinds of different ways by different people, and that you have to be open-minded and think about exactly what your meaning is behind your exposition of a theory. I'll just close with the last example of this. And this is a guy some of you have heard of. He's got a new book out, Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates. And when I read this book, there was a part that just jumped out at me. It's very relevant to our atheist communities, and that is he's an atheist too. So there's a section where he's explaining that, yeah, he's an atheist. He grew up in an atheist household. They didn't attend church. They didn't believe in that stuff. But read that last bit. My understanding of the universe was physical, and its moral arc bent toward chaos, then concluded in a box. What's happening here is meaning. That Coates is saying, here's my atheist worldview, and I've thought about it, and from my own experience, this is what it leads me to conclude, that this is what the world ends in a box. And that's kind of sad and depressing. But still, that's a powerful meaning that he's got as well. And it's something that we have to consider as atheists and secular people, is that there's a lot of different views of atheism out there. We are returned once again to that concept of diversity, that there's adaptedness and diversity, and far too often we undervalue the importance of diversity in addressing our goals. That diversity is what's bringing meaning to us. Okay, so I'll end there with one last quote. It's a short one from Kropotkin. Variety is life, uniformity is death. And thank you. Do we have time for questions? I don't know, I kind of got long-winded, but okay. My time's up. Okay. Get out of here. Yeah. Oh.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you.